Welcome to the video for Lesson 1 of the Turn the Lights On curriculum. This lesson introduces engineering design and the problem to the students. In this video, we will discuss engineering notebooks, engineering as a discipline, and the engineering design process, and go step by step through the lesson. At the end of this lesson, your students should be able to describe the essential features of an engineering design process, define an engineering problem from the perspective of stakeholders, and engage in early parts of problem scoping, particularly identifying the stakeholders and the client, and identifying the client's needs. This lesson can be completed in one 50-minute class period, assuming your students have some familiarity with engineering. So let's get started with the introduction part of the lesson. Within the Turn the Lights On curricular unit, you will be implementing 3 engineering constructs with your students: engineering notebooks, the concept of engineering itself, and the engineering design process. Let's take a deeper look at each of these. Let's first give an introduction to the unit and then explore the engineering notebooks. You will begin by introducing the unit to students in a very quick manner by just helping students understand that this is a problem for a local community in southern Indiana. Then students will need to understand how engineers work. Because right away students will be using their engineering notebooks, we will begin with an introduction to these notebooks. So, what is an engineering design notebook? Engineers must always keep track of their ideas and data about their work so that they can defend their designs and analyses. This is for a variety of reasons, such as remembering the reasons behind important decisions and processes we have worked on, keeping a running record in order to keep a high-level view of the project, having evidence for getting patents, and defending our designs to our clients. So how do we use these notebooks in the classroom? The notebooks in the curriculum are set up to be ways for your students to keep details of their work and current thinking at any point in time. They are also set up so that as the student progresses, the notebook will tell the story of their work. Throughout the curriculum, there are notebook prompts and pages for you to have your students work through the design process and gather evidence for the decisions they are making. This is done through prompts that tie to the engineering design challenge. The students should also use their notebooks to record new engineering or other STEM vocabulary as they encounter these words. You can have the students use a blank notebook or just write in the prompts, which are given at the end of the curriculum in one place. Or you can make copies of the duplication masters and have students paste them in a traditional notebook or keep them in a 3-ring binder. And here you can see some examples of student work from a different unit on light. In this first image, students are exploring materials and relating them to how they interact with light. This is to allow them to learn about materials they may want to use as they plan for their design challenge. The second image shows a student's plan for their design. It's a schematic for their layout for the laser light security system they are designing. This final image shows a table of vocabulary words that the student is keeping as they move through the curriculum. The table here includes the keyword, the information about the word or its definition, a memory cue, which you can see is a picture to help the students relate the word to their scientific meaning, and a real-world example for application. Okay, now let's spend some time thinking about what engineering is as a field and a discipline. You will need to take some time with your students to assess their current knowledge of engineering. If they are novices to engineering and engineering design, you will want to spend a little more time here helping them wrap their heads around the new field they are going to become familiar with. You will start by having students think about what engineering is and what engineers do. Take a moment now to pause and think about your answer to these questions, or discuss with a partner or team if you are participating in this video as a group. As you thought about or discussed engineering, you likely used words such as design, product, manufacture, etc. Did you also talk about technologies? In fact, engineering is at the heart of a field that designs, manufactures, and operates efficient and economical technologies. These technologies are designed with a purpose through creativity. But engineers use disciplines, in particular, a lot of science and mathematics, as their evidence for the designs they are working on. As you allow students to explore these questions, help them to realize that everything that is not a part of the natural world is likely touched by an engineer. Even science, which studies the natural world, uses technologies to understand it, and that requires engineering. Engineering is all around the world we live in. So helping make connections is very useful in engaging your students. Furthermore, you may want to help students think beyond the typical or traditional ways people think about engineering. That is, engineering is about cars or planes or buildings, but rather help them understand that engineers have a role in making the world a better place, such as making better hip joint replacements so that people can have mobility in their daily lives and not need a second surgery, or making travel safer for children by designing car seats that dissipate force and protect the heads and torsos of children riding in vehicles. Finally, it's important to understand that not all technologies are physical things. Engineers also design processes. For example, engineers design the process for how planes travel from one airport to another, taking into account space at airports, number of travelers needed on each plane, cost per ticket, where another plane will be needed, and when. Those are just some examples of these things. These competing ideas make processes like these messy, and engineers work within their problem to develop optimal solutions that affect both the client, the airlines and the airports, and the end user, the travelers. Within engineering, there are many ways that engineers think about design. This representation of design was developed by compiling how accreditation boards for engineering around the world look at design, from many different research articles on design, and from collecting expert opinions on design thinking. You will need to introduce the design process to your students. Throughout the curriculum, you will use this design process to guide students' thinking. Just like is true with the scientific process, there are many ways that engineers work through design. This is not the only available representation. The big thing to remember is that engineers think in a general way about design, which is represented here, but that they make decisions about what to do next based on what they've just learned, and they use evidence to make those choices. I will go into detail about this graphic within this video. As you work with your students, use the most salient pieces of this to help them understand engineering design. The first thing you need to notice about this graphic is that the design process is broken into two main blocks. The first block represents problem scoping. Engineers spend an incredible amount of time trying to understand the problem. This is accomplished by listening to and working with their client, spending time thinking about and collecting evidence of the needs of the end user of the design, researching what's been done previously to solve the same or similar problems, and learning about relevant content that may help in the design. There are two steps here, defining the problem and learning about the problem. We will go through these steps in more detail in a moment. The second block represents solution generation. This includes careful planning of the solution, trying the plan out to see if it works, testing that solution, and then deciding if the solution is good enough to move toward implementation in the real world or if redesign is needed. Going back to the problem scoping, let's take a look at defining the problem. Here, students need to take time to understand who the client is, what the client needs, and why the client needs it. This is often a place that students have a difficult time identifying. It is really easy to go right to a solution that they think will solve the client's problem. As an example, let's use the light curriculum example from earlier. The client puts forth that they have a museum that's going to have art on display that needs to be protected from theft. The problem here is that the client needs to protect the art so that the art does not get stolen. But often students will say something like, the client needs a security system to protect the art, which is getting at the solution, rather than just focusing on the problem. Keeping it about the problem and the reason for the problem will allow students not to pigeonhole themselves into a direction too early in the process. The students also need to consider who will use the design, the end user, and what the needs and wants are of this end user. Sometimes the client and the end user are the same person or people, but this is rarely the case. And we need to think about the criteria and constraints of the problem. A simple way to think about defining the problem is the statement, who needs what, because why, and then filling in the blanks. So let's start by filling in the who. We're going to dig into the stakeholders a little bit more deeply. Stakeholders are the people or groups of people who have an interest in the project and who will be affected by the project. This can incorporate a lot of different people. To keep things simple, in this curriculum, we will focus mostly on two stakeholders, the client and the end user. The client is the person who has asked the engineers to work on a problem. They are ultimately the person or people who need to be satisfied by the work. They will also identify the scope of how the problem can be solved by helping engineers understand the criteria and constraints under which the engineers must work. This is different from the end users, who are the people who end up using the design, and other stakeholders may be affected by the design. Let's consider an example of designing a wastewater treatment plant. The client may be the mayor of a city. The end users will be the employees at the plant, and other stakeholders are the people of the city who will want their wastewater dealt with in a safe and effective manner, regulators who must verify that the wastewater plant is doing its job effectively, and policymakers who will consider the design and if it meets or exceeds policy, potentially causing changes to policy in the future. So you can see a myriad of stakeholders play a role in what engineers do. However, communicating with the client about the problem is a big part of problem scoping that we will focus on within this curriculum. The students will develop questions for the client and provide ideas about what they need to learn about in order to solve the problem. In the notebooks, students will also be asked to develop a problem statement. The purpose of a problem statement is to guide the work of engineers as they go through the design process, referring back to and iterating on the problem statement as they learn more and develop more expertise in the design space. So, the problem statement is an interpretation of the client's needs and/or their wants. Here are some guidelines for how to scaffold a problem statement for your students. A good problem statement includes a clear reference to the client and possibly other stakeholders. It states the needs, problem, or focus of the project, and it includes an explanation of why the problem is important to solve. This is usually followed by the specifications for solving the problem, which include the criteria and constraints. So now let's dig into criteria and constraints a little bit more deeply. In defining the problem, engineers need to know the criteria for solving the problem. Criteria are the things that the solution will be judged against. This includes aspects of a design that relate to the success of the design and what stakeholders want and the requirements for the design to be a successful design. These criteria are useful to compare multiple acceptable solutions. Within criteria are a special set of criteria called constraints. Constraints are criteria that restrict the design solution. These are requirements that must be met for design, or the model, to be acceptable. Can you think of different criteria where some are constraints and others are not? You can think of constraints as the items that the client will say that your solution is not viable if it does not meet. For example, budget. The design can't cost more than X dollars. Or the use of certain items. The design must not incorporate plastics. Whereas criteria that are not constraints are usually more comparative in nature, such as aesthetics. The design is attractive. Ergonomics. The design is comfortable. Or maintenance. The design does not require a lot of upkeep. The other step within problem scoping is learn. This is primarily where the students will gather the background information, including the science and mathematics they need to learn. Together, you will identify some of the things they need to learn about during the define space. This allows for students to see the connection to the problem they are trying to solve, as well as feel like the STEM you are teaching them was their idea. Also, during this time, it's important to think about what has previously been done to solve this and similar problems, and to begin to think about how we measure the success of the product in order to improve it. Moving into the solution generation space, the first step here is to plan. In the plan stage, students will continue to think back on the problem definition to give more information to the criteria. Part of the planning is to generate ideas of possible solutions, which is called ideation. In ideation, students will use some brainstorming techniques to think about different possibilities of ways to solve the problem with a focus on thinking outside the box in order to get more novel ideas and generate multiple solution paths. In order for a solution to be viable, the students will have to consider the constraints or the requirements of the solution to ensure the client will even consider their solution. But also, a big part of the planning is to consider the trade-offs. Trade-offs are the constraints and criteria that compete with one another. Once students have had the opportunity to really think about different ideas, they must choose a solution to try out. Then develop detailed plans for their solution, which include things such as blueprints, schematics, cost sheets, and storyboards. These allow for multiple representations of the solution, which will help students think critically about their work. Once they have picked their solution and planned it, it is time to put it into action. Here they will also consider how to optimize their design, use criteria and constraints, and consider trade-offs from the problem and plan to build a prototype. A prototype is a testable representation of a solution. They can also build a model or a final product, depending on what kind of design you are working on and how testable that design is in a repeatable fashion. Every prototype or product needs to go through the testing phase. Here, students will consider how to best test their solutions based on information they gathered during the learn phase. They will develop or run experiments or use rubrics to know if their current solutions are meeting the criteria, constraints, and needs. And they will collect and analyze data as evidence for whether or not their solution is meeting the client's needs and wants. Finally, the students will have to decide whether or not their current solution is good enough to present to the client, or if they need to revisit previous stages to make minor or major changes to their design. Some questions they may need to consider are users able to use the design to help with the problem? Does the design meet criteria and stay within the constraints? And how could the design be improved based on the test results and feedback from the client or user? A very important aspect of design to consider is that design is iterative. This means that when we as engineers think about what is next, we always consider what we have learned in the current step and what needs to be done next. So notice the arrows that allow for decisions to go back to previous steps. Also, the fact that failure in a design does not mean failure at the subject is one of my favorite parts of putting engineering into the K-12 classroom. Most of the curriculum at K-12 has right and wrong answers, but engineering is not like that. Our solutions may fail, but our goal is to learn from that failure and try again to improve it. And improvement is always possible in design. So that's a fabulous reason to have engineering as a part of what we do in our classrooms. And then finally, notice the side section on the graphic called communication and teamwork, and that it threads throughout the process. Engineers must communicate with each other, the client, and the end user to make sure that the product is easily understandable. They use evidence to support the design decisions they make and to convince the client that their solution is the one to choose, and they work in teams. This is important because it allows for different viewpoints, which makes products better. As you teach engineering in your classroom, you will need to use good teamwork pedagogies to support your students so that they learn to value the diversity of thought on the team and learn to incorporate that value into their work. So now that you are familiar with the various stages of the design process, try answering this question. If you had 1 hour to solve an engineering problem, what would you do first? Press pause to think about your answer or discuss it with teammates. Hopefully, you identified that you need to spend a lot of that time in trying to understand the problem so that you can effectively solve it rather than just blindly jumping in and going right to the solution. As a teacher, this is one of the things you will really have to help your students focus on. The tendency is to go right to solution generation, but problem scoping makes solutions richer and more meaningful. So once you have a good handle on design, next you will introduce the students to power generation. You will ask them questions about where the power in their homes and school comes from and how they think it is generated. In this space, provide the students examples of different types of power generators, such as coal plants, nuclear power plants, wind turbines, and solar panels. So that concludes the introduction. Let's move on to the activities section of this lesson. The activities in Lesson 1 are meant to guide the students through defining the problem using problem scoping. First, students will be introduced to the client and the problem. To introduce the problems, students will watch a video with their teammates about power generation through coal and the effects of a coal power plant to give background and context to the problem they will be presented with. The curriculum documents include a link to this video, but also consider pausing and watching the video now if you have not already seen it. Once the students have watched this video, discuss the issues that surround using coal as our primary energy source. Next, you will introduce students to the client and the client's problem. You will start by introducing the scenario of a client that wants to hire your class as an engineering consulting group. Pause the video and go to the Duplication Master 1A client letter. Read the letter to review the client expectations. Also take a moment to review the Duplication Master's 1C, which contains maps for the area where they will design their prototypes. Using the information from the client letter, let's focus in on the client and end users. So, who are the stakeholders for this project? Pause the video to identify the client, the end users of the design, and any other important stakeholders. Our client is the Director of the Indiana Office of Energy Development, Deepti Rajeshwari. The end users are the people who will put the design into practice. They are the employees of each of the power generation plants. But other important stakeholders include the people who live in New Albany, who both use the energy and will have to live with any consequences of those forms of energy generation. Take 1 minute to reflect on the perspective of different users and stakeholders. What could be their expectations? Their different expectations might conflict. What would be the best solution to meet different expectations? Pause here. As you implement this with your students, have them take on the perspectives of the stakeholders and think about what it would be like to be them. This will help them use engineering empathy, which is an engineering habit of mind, as they think about their designs. Finally, students will work on answering a couple of questions to help them in the problem scoping stage. They will answer the questions individually first. The individual prompts, which are questions 1 and 2, focus on the issues surrounding coal-fired electricity sources and things that students might want to know from the client to help them understand the problem better. Here, helping students think about the criteria and constraints may help them figure out the questions to ask. Then, in their teams, they will pick 2 final questions to ask the client. You can remind the students that the client does not have time to answer many questions, so they should pick the most important ones. In conclusion, you can share these questions among the class to get one list of unique questions to pose to the client. As the teacher, after class, you will develop answers to the questions from students to the client. There is a set of questions and answers in the curriculum guide to help you, but if student questions go beyond these, the answers you provide should stay within the scope of the problem throughout the curriculum. You may want to look at both Lesson 2 and Lesson 6 to see criteria and constraints used in the design. After the students have reflected individually, then we're ready for the closure of this lesson. That concludes Lesson 1. So now, take some time and plan for how you will implement Lesson 1 with your students. Take notes in your curriculum document about things you want to remember, and perhaps add information about timestamps from this video that may help you later when you want to review. When you are ready, proceed to the Lesson 2 video.